Hello, my name is Tim Williams from Coast Informatics, where we focus on terminology solutions. Today, I will be giving a short introduction to terminology. This video is meant for people that are brand new to terminology, who have no previous experience with terminology. So let's begin. Let's first think about a scenario. So you're on vacation and you do some rock climbing and you take a fall. As a result, you go to the emergency room and you're treated for a broken arm. So when you're done at the emergency room, you go back home. You have to follow up with your primary care physician and orthopedist and continue that treatment that you originally received at the emergency room until you're completely healed. So when you go into the emergency room for a visit, they're going to probably order an x-ray, they're going to do some labs, and that's going to result in some reports going back and forth to the emergency room. And then when everything's done, all that information needs to in some way be communicated to your personal health record or through your primary care physician. Now, if you're in an integrated health environment where all the systems are the same, everything's communicated seamlessly, this works, pretty well. You have the same systems using the same information, the same records and everything. But if you're on vacation, the chances are you're probably not in the same integrated health system, and that information is going to have to flow back and forth. And in some cases, with radiology reports, that's probably through something physical like a DVD or a CD or something. So having that seamless flow of information is a much better outcome, a much better way of getting your information. But obviously that's not always the case. And if you think back 20, 30 years, all this was probably done through paper and faxes and things like that. Whereas now we're in a more electronic state of exchanging data. So the things that help us do that is a clinical terminology, and that clinical terminology is used to represent meaning within a patient record so that you can easily record that data so that it can be communicated and retrieved in a consistent manner across languages, countries, and institutions. So you can record something, let's say you're on vacation in Spain and the primary language is Spanish, and then when you get home, that data can be translated into English seamlessly through the clinical terminology that you've used. So it represents that meaning in a consistent way across languages, countries, and institutions. Clinical terminology is kind of known by different names. People call it similar things like vocabularies and ontologies and classifications. Today, we're going to name it clinical terminology and go from there. There are some differences between those different phrases, but for the most part, we're going to call that a clinical terminology.
So I have a question.
Yes.
Tim, what happened before there were clinical terminologies?
So actually, clinical terminologies have been around in some way, shape, or form for a long time. So kind of the history of terminology started with the London Bills of Mortality around 1592, and that was used to monitor burials in London. But kind of the next generation didn't come around until the late 1800s with ICD, International Classification of Diseases, and that kind of got standardized in the 40s. And then SNOMED came around in the 60s, and that's kind of that led to the modern instance of SNOMED in 2002, SNOMED CT. And then LOINC has been around since the early 90s. So kind of the modern terminology came around in the 90s. So before that, things were free text with some of these codings on the back end that sort of represented meanings, but not to the level that we needed to do a lot of the sophisticated exchange of data that we have now. So why do terminologies matter? So terminologies help us aggregate patient descriptions by meaning. And what that really allows us to do is facilitate data entry. So by using terminologies, we minimize the amount of free text that we put into a patient record. It's very difficult to get the actual meaning out of free text. So there's certain technologies like natural language processing that have taken giant leaps in the last 20 years or so to be able to do that, but they're still not perfect, and they still may overstate something or understate something depending on the technology and how smart it is. So having that data entered and consistently entered in a way that is retrievable is important. That then allows us to communicate that data from one system to the next and have that data machine readable, so that I could use, let's say, Spanish in one system and English in the next, and it'll be able to understand it and translate it and display it so that the next person that is viewing it understands that data much better. And then it also allows us to link that to patient safety. So programmatic clinical decisions, practice guidelines, and order sets are all possible by using clinical terminology in the front end by recording it and then being able to link it to things that help you practice medicine in a much better way. And then after all that data is in, we can then use powerful analytics to analyze data to determine things like the best treatments for certain diseases, to analyze data to figure out who's received certain drugs or vaccines and who hasn't. So we can do all those things by using terminology, where if we used free text, it would be a much more labor-intensive process. So what are some examples of clinical terminology? SNOMED CT is probably the most comprehensive multilingual clinical terminology that's out there in the world today. And it can be used for anything from clinical documentation to reporting, for drugs, labs, procedures. So it's pretty broad in scope. However, each national extension to SNOMED, National Release Center, maintains a country-specific extension. So not all countries are members of SNOMED, but the ones that are tend to have some kind of extension to SNOMED, either for translations or mappings or value sets. And then there's another standard called LOINC, which is used for laboratory test orders and observations, and it's maintained by Regenstrief. ICD-10 is a diagnostic classification standard that's used for clinical and research purposes, and it's maintained by the World Health Organization. And an example of a drug terminology that's out there would be RxNorm. RxNorm is a U.S. specific drug terminology, and it's used to normalize clinical drugs and links to names from common drug vocabularies that are used in the U.S., like First Data Bank or Gold Standard, and a few others that are available through the and that's maintained by the National Library of Medicine. So let's go back to our scenario. So within the EHR, from the ER visit, we have probably we're going to use SNOMED and RxNorm, but we'll also have LOINC in there from the lab report. So we'll have some LOINC in the ER visit record as well, just from communicating with the lab back and forth. The radiology report, there's going to be a few standards used there, but we'll have SNOMED for any kind of findings that come out of the radiology report. And then from a lab report standpoint, we would have LOINC and SNOMED that would be available in that lab report as well. So underneath the scenes, you'll have a lot of these different terminologies that are available, for example, but they may vary. So in a different country, they may use a different set of standards. They may not use RxNorm. For example, in Spain, they probably wouldn't use RxNorm because RxNorm is a US standard, but they may use SNOMED and LOINC. In the UK, they may use a different set of standards as well. So every country is a little different as to what they would have at each of these different points in the scenario. So let's talk about a few of the basic components of a terminology. These are not exhaustive list. There's only 2 of them, but these are some of the basic components that all terminologies would have. So one of them being a unique identifier. So on the left-hand side, we have a LOINC concept, the creatine moles, volumes in urine, and it has a unique identifier. And then on the right-hand side, we have myocardial infarction, and it also has a unique identifier. So in both of these terminologies, those unique identifiers are persistent. They don't change. They're never they're never deleted out of the terminology. They always exist for all time, so that if you ever use it at any point in time, it's going to be there, and you'll be able to retrieve it. You'll also have a set of descriptions, textual descriptions to describe that unique identifier. So on the left-hand side, the LOINC concept has 6 different descriptions. On the right-hand side, the SNOMED concept has 32, including some that are inactive, like the ones that are grayed out here. Those are inactive descriptions that have been inactivated over time.
Hi, I have a question. Why do identifiers have to be unique?
Having a unique identifier is important, as I said, to ensure that over time you're able to retrieve that data, even if it has been retired. So if an identifier is deleted out of the terminology, or if it's reused even, which is even worse, you lose that clinical meaning. So as I said earlier on an earlier slide, the purpose of a terminology is to represent the meaning of what's happening when you see that patient, or when you're trying to record data about somebody or something. And if that identifier changes or is not unique and can be used for multiple different things, then that causes problems when we try to go and retrieve that data.
I have a question.
Yes.
Are these the only components of terminologies?
No, so these are just 2. Every terminology is a little different. There are definitely some terminologies where these are the only things that they provide, are a unique identifier and a set of descriptions. But for example, in SNOMED, there are relationships that give SNOMED a computer readable definition so that you can use that. As you can see, both concepts have hierarchies in this case. So they have some kind of hierarchical structure. So these are just a few of the shared common components of terminologies, but there are a lot more that we can talk about in further presentations.
Thank you.
In summary, clinical terminologies help us ensure a more complete, seamless, reusable flow of information by making sure that that data is representable and can be translated by language, by institutions, and by use cases, and that they have varying different representations, but they do share some common components like unique identifiers and textual descriptions, but there are definitely different formats that terminologies are released in, different components that some terminologies have that others do not. So if you'd like to learn more, subscribe to our channel, and we'll have further presentations that go into each of these topics in more depth. Thank you.